Time I can start this as well. Okay, so I'll share my screen. I think I have one more example to cover. Yeah. So so now we are on the example for closure, right? So what is the advantage of using closure in JavaScript? So basically, we want to have a method, and so you can see this is the method, and we have a nested method which is using a variable which is acting like an abstract variable for this function. So if you see this counter, right, we define this counter as 0, and we keep incrementing the value by 1, and we are printing it, right? So if I call this function once, the value is 1. If I call again, now the value will not be initialized with a 0. Now the scope is defined. So if you see the scope, this is a global variable. It is defined once, but with this uh, like function instead of function, it will help you to achieve a static variable kind of functionality. So I think you must have used static variable in Java, which is you initialize once and then you can increase the value, but you cannot uh, define it again, right? So it's keep incrementing by 1 in our example. So if you want to achieve that functionality of static variables kind of thing, then you can use closure. So if I just print the output for this, you can see it's printed 1, 2, and 3, right? So yeah, sometimes it is. I don't think like it will be beneficial for you for D3JS, but yes, to understand some few core concept because you already familiar with other concept like higher order function and filters and prototype. So this is like another functionality of JavaScript which you should know. Okay, anybody has any doubt like why we use closure? So,
Yes, sir. Also, why are we using closure?
okay, so basically if you see an abstraction in Java, you want to achieve an abstraction in JavaScript. So if you see other languages like Java, you define a variable inside a class, right? And then you have methods which uses those class variables inside methods. But how you can achieve that? So if I give you like analogy here, you can assume like this is a class sum, and this is your class variable counter, and this is your function which is inside a class, right? So we are trying to achieve the same functionality. Now, if you see here in this, we are using ES6, right? And this one is a core JavaScript. So in ES6, you can write like constructor this dot value, and then you can define the another methods and use this value. So you can see like you are also doing the same thing. You are trying to update the value, right, with a with a class one, right? But this is like a higher level syntax. But exactly what happens inside JavaScript is actually this. So this code compiles into this code, and you can assume like your sum will be another class if you compare with the higher
Okay.
level, and you can see the constructor, you will have a counter variable, and this will be another method which will be utilizing, which will be updating your class variable, right? So this is like understanding like how ES6 and how the core fundamental of JavaScript, how actually it compiles down into core like core JS, and how your browser or your browser engine like V8 interpret your code, which is ES6, right? So you need to know. So that's where the closure is. So you are creating an abstraction with the help of closure. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So I think that's all we have. There are some other examples. Uh, so not necessarily for you to understand because uh, maybe you can go yourself and understand like how scope in JavaScript works. But for you to work on D3JS, you don't necessarily get into that details.
So,
So yeah, Ganesh.
in the previous example, the previous one you will showing here. So, what is that FO?
Which
Just now before this, you are showing us some other example, right?
which one you're talking about? Concatenation?
No, 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 no. Just before this example, you said
Okay,
there
arithmetic.
is. Yeah, yes, yes, yes.
Mhm.
Before this.
This one?
No, just before this, you are
I
showing
think
some
it
other
was
example.
in scope.
Okay, you're talking
Yeah,
about this.
scope.
Mhm.
That's the scope. Yeah, I think that's the scope. So, what is this FOO in this? Can you please?
Where this?
Okay, console.log FOO. You are writing. Okay, you're creating a var for.
Yeah, this. Okay, so yeah, so this is like another example we have not covered yet. So scope. So basically, like for you to understand how scope in JavaScript works. So if you see this method, so we have this method. Inside this, we have defined a variable called foo and given a value as one, and then we have a function, right? And you're defining a var foo equals to 2, and you're calling bar again. So when you call bar, whether you will get 1 or whether you will get 2, right? So what should be the output? So you say the output will be 1 instead of 2. Why? Because the scope is defined in JavaScript. The scope of any variable is defined under the scope of a under the local scope. So there is a block scope, right? So what is block scope? So if I say this one, if I just write this and write any variable, c equals to 1, so this one is called block scope, right? And then you have a function scope. So you can see the function scope is this, and then you have a window scope, which is like your the global scope, which is like entire file. So when you call bar, right, now this foo doesn't have a access. So this inside this bar, right, so this foo has only access inside this function, and the value is 2 inside this function. It is not outside, because in JavaScript variable has a block scope or a function scope, right? So the foo value will be 2. If you print the foo value, it will be true. And then if true, that means always true, you're updating the value of 3. That means now the foo value will become 3, right? Because this is in the same scope, and this is the inner scope. So you, do you understand this? Like inner scope, function scope, and then nested function scope.
Yes, and I was just curious because I was going through some other example the previous day, and then I saw this FOO, so I thought that it's a different sort of function or something like that.
Okay, no, no, it's just a variable name, foo, right?
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So
So I think,
Gaurav,
yeah,
I might be too late to ask this,
yeah,
but can you scroll up?
yeah.
So if we are checking condition here, if true,
Hmm.
so it is checking the value of who, if who has a value. Is it like that?
No, no, no. If so, if true, we are. So this is just an example. So we are trying to make sure this if construct, right, always execute true. Right? So we are not checking any condition. We are just making sure. Uh, so this is a tricky question in JavaScript to understand scope. So we are just making sure like every time this is true. So we're not checking any
Okay.
condition. We're making sure this if should execute. This if block will
Okay.
execute
Okay.
every time.
Mm-hmm.
So just to make sure like whether the foo value will be 3 or whether the foo value will be 1. So now this is at the same scope, right? So this foo and this foo is at this function scope. So the value of foo will get updated to 3, right? But here you're calling the bar method, but this value we cannot access outside, right? So if you're printing the foo value, we will have this value. We will not have this value because
Okay. And
yeah,
yes, I understood that. This may be again very basic question. So, this is an example of function under function, right? So, w- first this first function is called, right? So,
yeah,
is it directly called, or I mean,
yes,
how is
so
it
yes,
executing? Is it
yeah.
it is directly called?
Yeah, so if you see this one, right? This function
Huh.
starts here and end here, and then we're calling this function. This is a self-executing function. So when you run this
Okay.
code, this will execute self. So it will call itself.
Okay. 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 Understood.
Yeah. So you can let me show you. We can just go to this inspect console. You can see 1 and 3. So it executes itself because we have this method. So yeah,
Okay.
so this is just for you to understand like how scope work, like whether the scope has an access at function level or maybe outside function level, how we define it. So maybe if you go through this example, you will get familiar with the scopes. So sometime what happen when you're working on JavaScript code, you might have issue with variables access scopes. So if you're familiar with these examples, you will not face those issues and you can debug your application faster. So yeah, so yeah, let's cover other two examples also. So we have another function. We define var a equals to 1. We have a test method. Now inside this, we are trying to print the console log. Now what will happen here? The one, now if you see, this a will look for, so every time whenever we so in JavaScript, the code executes line by line, right? So whenever we are here, right, it look up for the definition of var. So it doesn't find any definition inside this function. So it go up, it look up here, a equals to 1, right? So now a is defined, it doesn't throw. So do you think like a is not defined here, so it can go up here?
No, I guess because it will check it locally, right? The
Yes,
value of A.
yes. So it will check locally, but the definition is in like after this line, and JavaScript execute line by line. So whenever we are here, it throws an error. So
Right. It should throw another, right?
yeah, so it's a undefined declaration is present, but after using the variable. But for the other line, there will be no issues because we have a declaration and definition both. So it
But
just
in this output,
yeah,
first it has printed one, right? But we have
yes,
just
this one.
declared it.
No, no, no. We have a definition, right? So if you see here, so where
Uh,
a equals to 1, so then it goes, so this function will run for syntax.
you'd
It will
only
not,
then called.
yes, it will not
Okay.
execute, but it will run for syntax. Now, then it will go for console log A. So it will look up for this definition and declaration.
Oh.
It prints 1.
Mm,
And then it now it executes. So when it executes, it goes into this scope. It look up into this function scope whether we have
mm,
a definition and declaration of a. It says no,
mm.
so then it's a undefined declaration. But for the second a, when we console, we have a declaration and definition both, so it prints 2 as output.
Okay. Okay. Got it.
So similarly, you have like another example here. You have a var a, and you print console log, so it print 1. And when you call this, you console log. Now in this case it prints 1. Why? So but if you see in this case, right, it was throwing an error because the declaration happens at global scope, right? And here you are doing declaration inside the scope. So this function in this example, it knows like there is a declaration and definition in this scope but at later stage, so it will not look up for the value up. That's why it was undefined declaration. But here in this case, this function knows. So this, you can say the console log asks this test method whether we have a declaration. It says we don't have a declaration, but we got the glow from a global scope, right? So that's where it takes the global scope variable value instead of a equals to 2. So if you define this where a equals to 2, then in that case it should return an error for this, because for this method it has declaration and definition but at the later stage. So that's why. So always the scope will look up from you can say the inside to outside. So if it is not inside, it will look for the outside. So this test will say there is no declaration of a inside this, but it has here. So it can take the declaration from a, so it will not throw an error, but it will take the value from this a. So so that's the output 112. Yeah, I think that's it. Then another example. This is very minimal. Okay, so basically these three are the main examples for the closure. Oh, sorry, not for the closure, but for the scopes. Now, if I just recall, like what we have done today is understand the events. So we went through some of the basic events. We understand like why to use stop propagation, and also understand different use case of event object and what's the efficient way of using event. And we have also seen how we can add an event to a window object, and how we can get the specific event on an element on a DOM object, and also how to prevent the default behavior of a tag or a form. And yeah, and some events we have added on window object. And we have seen how we can add a custom event, maybe different combination of keys, which can be helpful when you are like you have so many events on a specific keys. So this might be helpful with the combination as well. We also understand like how to create dynamic element using JavaScript, and how you can leverage the CSS and use some specific properties of event, like current position of cursor, which is page X and page Y. And we also went through this like how you can access same type of element, like there is a multiple presence of same type of element, and you want to access the entire all the DOM nodes, and how you can convert that into an array and add events to each and every nodes. So we have seen specifically like most of the events which you're going to perform while building D3JS graphs. And then we have seen an example of chaining, how chaining work with an example in JavaScript in ES6. And you can see like how chaining for a function works, and how chaining for different object works. We have seen for an object as well as for a function method chaining. And then we also saw an example of a timer. So basically when you want to like have an event which is recurring after some specific period of time, so you can get use of set interval and clear interval in JavaScript. And with this example we also understood like higher order function. So this is more specifically like JavaScript for D3. And then we have seen few other example like closure, we have seen prototype, we have seen filter each, right? This is more important. And we have seen scopes. Yes. Yeah, I think that's what you can skip this optimum one. Yeah, I think that's what is required. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. So anybody have any doubt in today's session in events or chaining or any other concept like closure, prototype, scope? Will
No, Saurabh.
Okay, Ganesh is fine. What about Astha, you?
I'm good too.
Okay, and Raj?
I'm also good. Just need to practice and see. I have something. I'll get back to you in the next session for sure.
Yeah. So I will share you the zip of the entire code base, and you can practice, and then let me know if you have any doubt in the next session. And we will first try to clear all the doubts, and then we'll move to the other part of it. So Rupali, I think I just covered like I've showed you like in basically in high level overview what are the topics we covered today. So I think your background is computer science, right? Yeah. Or
Yes, Saurav, yes. So I'll be going through this recording. Please share this so that, in next session, if I have any doubts, I'll ask you.
sure. So I think we have. So I didn't record this one, which is I think just contain only one
Yeah,
example. But I do
yeah,
have
it's
recording for
okay.
the last two. So I will
Mm-hmm.
upload somewhere and then share with you everyone. You can go through that. And yeah, so the next class we'll be having a session on HTML and mostly on HTML5 and CSS3. We'll talk about SVG and also see what Canvas is, and we'll see some advanced properties of CSS3, which will be helpful for you to understand when you're implementing the D3JS graphs and maybe the complex graphs. So after the second class, we will jump into the D3JS. So what time is best suited for you, like tomorrow? Is this time works, or do you want me to schedule any other time? Because I'm free tomorrow.
A bit early would be better, Saurabh, for me. The rest of the team should decide
Yeah.
which time would be better.
So maybe you can discuss and maybe Asta can update me. Then we can schedule. So I have no issues like anytime tomorrow.
Sure, sure, sir.
Sure.
Guys,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Take care and bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Saurabh. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
sir.
Okay, bye bye. You're
Bye,
welcome.
guys.
Bye.